All right. Good afternoon, Dad.
Good afternoon.
Today is Wednesday, December 3rd, and maybe we can start by talking a little bit about Ukraine. We discussed that we don't think there's going to be a peace plan possible,
Yeah.
but do you think that most people right now that are just casual observers or the establishment itself, do they believe that this thing is wrapping up? Because I kind of feel that energy, at least the establishment, the West is Trump and them are trying to put that out there that
Right.
this is
Yeah.
wrapping up. Do people
Yeah.
believe that?
I think a lot of people in the mainstream, and people that have not been following the conflict very closely do have that impression. That is the impression that you're given in much of the mainstream media, and especially from the Trump administration. He's always trying to give these things a positive spin. What I would say, though, is that this is not the first time. I remember back in the spring, actually having conversations with people who think, it looks like they might settle this soon. And, it's very much the same. The Trump administration giving us positive spin, all the stories about how Russia is ready to collapse and, Putin really has an incentive, a need to negotiate some kind of ceasefire. So that's still out there. We've seen it more than once. I don't think it's particularly meaningful. But what I think is more significant is the change in tone within Ukraine. For the first time, I haven't heard anything specific, but you even from Zelensky himself, for the first time, I've detected a note of realism and pessimism, saying, difficult decisions are going to have to be made. We're facing a bleak winter, that kind of thing. And, again, it's kind of vague. It's not clear, maybe, he didn't see any indication of actually accepting the Russian demands. He didn't talk about things specifically. And when you get to the specifics, he rejects them again. But I would point to also a recent interview that was done with the former foreign minister of Ukraine, Kuleba. And he was saying basically, look, he didn't quite use those words, but we've lost this. We need to stop the fighting. Hey, let's call this a victory, because of course we know the Russians were trying to conquer our whole country and they failed, and I think that's remarkable. That's not what you heard from Kuleba in the past, and that's that it reflects something that's going on, not just within the leadership, but throughout Ukrainian society. Everyone from the ultranationalists, to just the average man in the street, there is a growing awareness that things are going badly and something needs to be done. But what you don't see is actually anybody in a position of power saying, okay, we have to accede to these specific Russian demands. So I don't know if it'll go anywhere, but it is an indication that things are starting to change. It's like the awareness of the the situation on the front is starting to really seep into the consciousness of Ukrainians in general.
Do you think that awareness will that force a peace plan? Do you think that it's in the realm of possibility? Because we were kind of ruling that a peace plan just not in the realm of possibility, just because the trust between Russia and the West is just non-existent.
Yeah, I think it's still. I wouldn't change my position on that. I don't think the chance of an actual settlement is negligible. It's again, I don't think anybody in the leadership. I read these comments, including by ultranationalists. A lot of the ultranationalists, more than the liberals, and I think it's because the ultranationalists are actually fighting. A lot of them are saying, "Hey, we really need a ceasefire," but they want a ceasefire. They still, so they can fight another day, and that's when you get into the discussions, and they're somehow thinking maybe a lot of them. I think a lot of them really do believe what the information that they get from mainstream Western media, that Russia's on the verge of collapse, they're suffering huge casualties, whatever. I think a lot of them do, in fact, believe that, or try to believe that, to comfort themselves. So they think that they can get a ceasefire, but they can't. One thing is that we've seen, in contrast to what we've noticed in Ukraine, there's this kind of maybe a softening of the attitude They're not quite there, but you sort of see at least a general change in attitude without any actual concrete change in position. But over on the Russian side, especially when we talk about Putin, he has been particularly outspoken. I mean, a lot of people were going after him, remember, a few weeks ago for being so wishy-washy and not, condemning and not speaking up more forcefully against the deployment of the Tomahawk missiles or the possible deployment of Tomahawk missiles, for example. And then in general, he was trying to maintain some sort of channel of communication. He still had some hope placed on the diplomatic option. But you just don't see that now. I mean, it seems like there's no round edges or soft edges to what he says. It's very hard. He is making it crystal clear that he has no intention, and the Kremlin has no intention of backing off on any of their demands, that they have made repeatedly over the last couple of years. So I think, if they think that if the people in Ukraine or in the West think that somehow the Russians are going to agree to a ceasefire, that's just not going to happen. The Russians continue to forge ahead, and things really are very, very grim on the Ukrainian side. It's amazing that they're still holding on. I think, again, a lot of it has to do with drone warfare and the fact that, you just have to proceed cautiously. As long as there's one drone operator with a fleet of drones, you can't just go marching across these fields or even send a column of tank across these fields. But in spite of the fact that they still have the drones, the Ukrainians do, though not as many as the Russians do, the Russians are making very significant advances.
How significant are we talking? We use the term crumbling. Are you ready to use the term collapse? Not yet, right?
Not yet. I think, the advances are real. There have been some different reports that have come out. There was one, I can't remember the name of the particular organization, said that the Russians gained 500 square kilometers, and that was the second most, since 2022, second largest gain in territory since 2022. But I go by Scott of Calibrated with Scott. I've just found him to be very, very reliable. He's been right again and again, and he puts it more at like 700 to 800 kilometers. And if that's the case, we're talking about the most, or it at least equals what the high point of last year in October, November. The Russians made some very significant advances. So let's say even if it equals it, though, I think that we have to point out to the qualitative difference, because the fighting that we're seeing is, in general, is taking place in places like, in cities. The Russians have actually taken Pokrovsk, and they're just finishing off Mirnograd. That's a city in a pre-war population of those two together. Kind of they form a small metropolitan area. It was well over 100,000. They're in Konstantinivka, and according to, I guess, the recent Russian MOD announcement, they have taken 30% of Konstantinivka. That's, again, it's a small city, but we're talking about 68,000 pre-war population. And then they've taken Kupyansk. That was maybe 28,000. They're in Liman, they're in Seversk. Seversk is small, but it's this, as one of those fortresses like Ugledar was in the south. That was very, very difficult to take. And their process of taking. So these are all, if you look at in terms of territory, we're seeing unusually rapid advances for this war. But it's more than that, because we're talking about the fall of many important towns and cities in rather quick succession. And that means more than just taking fields, taking a certain amount of territory. And when you look back, like at the fall of last year, that happened after the fall of Avdiivka, after the fall of Ugledar. Again, Ugledar, though it was small, it was a real fortress up on a hill, and of course Avdiivka was a real fortress city. It had the reputation of being like the most fortified city in the world. I don't know if you can actually measure that, but it may very well be true. And so the Russians after that were largely out in the open and dealing with small towns, and so they were able to advance very rapidly. So I think that this, whether it's 500 kilometers or 800 kilometers, this is square kilometers. This is very significant because of the nature of the territory that's being taken. And when they get all these cities, I think we're just going to see a real acceleration. They'll be able to go off in many different directions. It's what you call an operational bloom after you break through some major fortifications.
Do you expect to see some type of operational bloom this winter soon?
Well, it's certainly possible. I mean, we may be seeing the beginnings of it, actually, Pokrovsk. Even though Mirnograd hasn't fallen, it's actually, Mirnograd's pretty far to the rear now. And it's just a matter, I don't know why those guys haven't surrendered. There's nothing they can do. They're just hanging in there because they're getting some occasional shipments by drone. But the Russians are just taking out entire towers, with these Fab 3000s. This is really so obviously that battle is basically over. I don't know why they're still there. And meanwhile, the Russians are starting to expand actually to the west from Pokrovsk. They've taken a significant amount of territory already. So we may see something come out of there soon. And now whether it continues through the winter, well, I guess it's kind of up to the Russians. Last year, there was something of an operational pause in the winter. And I don't know if that was, why that was. It just may be they made a decision that it was time to, consolidate and, move up the logistical lines, all that kind of thing. So there's certainly the possibility of it. That's what I would say.
Right. I mean, you said that Zelensky has made this realization that this is going to be a tough winter, that things aren't going well for Ukraine. There might be an operational bloom, a faster crumbling of the front line. How are you supposed to negotiate in this situation? Like if you are the U.S. or Ukraine and you're supposed to negotiate with Russia while a collapse is occurring
Right.
or about to occur, that's strange,
sense.
right? It doesn't make you can't negotiate in that situation, right? It's just that things are changing too rapidly.
Yeah, well, you just take what you should do is just take the offer.
Right, take what you
it's
can.
Going to get worse.
Right.
They say like, okay, this is hard. This is a bitter pill to swallow. But clearly, they are going to take the Donbass. They're poised to do it, over the course of the next several months. And then, that offer where we say we withdraw troops, that's going to be off the table. And so we don't have any bargaining chips at all. And then after that, it's going to be more than the Donbass. Maybe they would have been willing to, for example, withdraw from Dnipropetrovsk, because that's not one of the oblasts that is considered Russian territory. They might have been. Now, I think there would have been some room for a little bit of negotiation. Okay, we'll for example, we withdraw from the Donbass, but in exchange, at least you let us have these territories. Or there was that talk of a temporary ceasefire for Kherson and Zaporozhye. Maybe they could get something there, at least temporarily. I don't know. But they won't have anything to bargain with. And then once the Russians take it all, then they're going to go on and take more. And, they will have no reason to give up what they've taken in Dnipropetrovsk or in Kharkov, for example. Or Sumy, for that matter.
Do you think Putin is maybe a little bit pleased about the stubbornness of the Ukrainians and the refusal to accept his demands, because it will allow Russia to take really some of the key cities that are not in these Donbass, Kharkov and Odessa? And we've talked about taking that Black Sea coast. I mean, those are really kind of the crown jewels. If those get absorbed to the Russian Federation, I think it would be a greater victory for Russia.
Right. Yeah, well, possibly. You can't be sure with Putin, because I think he really does want a diplomatic solution. So I think he really was willing to give up Odessa and Nikolaev if he could get a real negotiated settlement, he could get everything that he wanted. That would, but on the other hand, it's clear that I think he understands that quite well. And he has at times referred to Odessa and Novorossiya. So I think that's something that he does understand. No question, he recognizes the full value of that coast, especially recently in light of the attacks on the tankers. I think there was a third attack with actually an aerial drone that did minor damage, but it did do damage. He said, again, this is kind of the new Putin. He said quite bluntly that if this continues, then we're going to just shut down the ports in southern Ukraine. And they can do it, either by mining them or just by declaring that, the water's a combat zone and warning all ships from entering those waters.
Mm. Well, Witkoff has to be aware of the situation that the West has no leverage. The U.S. has very little, if any, leverage over Russia.
Right.
But he's over there negotiating, and he has to be aware of the situation on the front line, the fact things are crumbling, Zelensky's corruption scandal, just everything is bleak. What is he supposed to say to them? I mean, the Russians would just be like, well, look, this is how it is. You guys lost. It's over. So here are the terms. Do you think that's what's being said? Isn't Witkoff aware?
Probably. They spent 5 hours, I think, talking with Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Again, neither of whom is a diplomat. Talking with Putin yesterday in Moscow, and the reports. I think nobody. It's clear that nothing concrete was achieved, meaning that there wasn't any agreement, and it seems clear to me that the Russians stuck to their guns and said that, hey, we can start to negotiate and talk, but we're not promising you anything. We have to set up these teams, do it the way that this is what Putin said recently at a press conference in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. He just said, we've got to do it the way, enough of the, this amateur show. We have to do it the way that it's always been done and the only way that it can be done. That's pretty much what he said. And that is by setting up experienced negotiating teams and letting them get to work. So I think that's part of what he told him. Look, I'm not going to give you anything. All I'm going to promise is that we will talk to you, but we got to do it. If it's going to go anywhere, it has to be done in a serious professional way. And I don't know if Trump and the Trump administration are capable of doing that.
Right. What do you think is going to be the fate of the leaders of the Ukraine or just the champions of this war when they lose? There's a butcher's bill that's going to be paid. Will these people be killed? Will they be imprisoned? Will there be war crime trials? I mean, what happens at the end? And this is something that I think will also propel the war further, is because the losing side knows that there's a butcher's bill to be paid and the people on their side are going to have to pay it, right? What is that?
I think a lot of them will run off and escape any sort of consequence for any of their actions. Like we saw Mindich recently. He's in Israel, laughing all the way to the bank there. And I think we'll see more of that. Not just Israel, but Miami and the French Riviera. I guess the big question is, I think all of these people understand is that they can't cross the ultranationalists, because those people have made it clear that, if you cross us, we have ways of penalizing you. In other words, we will kill you. So I think that they all understand that. And maybe if they can just get out and still remain on the good side of the ultranationalists, they can make it to safety somewhere.
You think so?
I think it's possible. I think it really is.
So really the risk is from the ultranationalists, not any actual type of tribunal or any type of that's just a pipe to hope that
it's not going to, right. Because the Europeans are not going to do that. They're not going to bring these people to justice. The Americans are not going to do it.
Right. And then the Russians, if they can't get them, then.
Right. Exactly. I mean, there is always a chance that in the case of some particularly some notorious characters that the Russians could send assassins and take care of them. I know, like, the Russians clearly have assassinated at least a few people in Europe. One of them was the pilot who I think flew his helicopter over the Ukrainian side, and when he landed, the two of his crew members were instantly killed, by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians then exfiltrated him, or to, I believe it was Portugal or Spain, one of those countries. But then the Russians caught up with him, and I think it had to be the Russians, and he was assassinated. So there is a chance, In general, the Russians haven't done that, but with some particularly notorious characters, they have.
Okay. Yeah, I still just struggle to see how this war ends. It doesn't feel like there will never be a neat little bow to wrap it up. I just feel like it's just going to just kind of grind on, and there will be these facades of negotiations and talks, but nothing will happen. But I just don't know what the end result ends. I just feel like it will always be a bubbling conflict at the end, just right there on the border.
Right. Well, that's the problem. That's the real danger. And I think that the Russians increasingly have come to recognize that, Putin in particular, he's held his hopes out for a diplomatic solution. But it appears to me that he has pretty much given up on that. And he understands that it's just going to be, we just have to take the territory that we have to take, and in that way reduce the Ukrainian threat, render them weak and unable to ever threaten us again.
Mm. Okay, well, is there anything else you want to cover with Ukraine, or you want to move over to Venezuela?
I just want to maybe comment very briefly on Zelensky. He's obviously in real serious trouble back there, but but as always is the case, when he's in serious trouble, you find him in foreign capitals. So he's made a trip. He's been, visited Sweden and France, and I'm not quite sure where he is right now. But what really struck me was that how little he has to show for that. Of course, he gets the big hugs and the photos, standing there smiling next to Macron, in front of the Elysee or whatever. But all that Macron gave him was 100 million, and then 100 million euros, and then I think in the case of Sweden, it was the same. And I stopped and just did sort of like a back of the envelope kind of calculation. They've been eyeing this 140 billion euro. The Russian assets that are worth that amount, and they've got this crazy scheme of using that as collateral, for a loan that will never be repaid. So in other words, they really simply are stealing the Russian assets. And it's been said, well, that would be good enough for, I've heard different, estimates, a year and a half, maybe even 2 years. But let's even call it 2 years. It's probably not even good enough for 2 years. In that case, if you do the calculations, 100 million compared to that, if you need 140 billion euros just to support, like to keep the government running, I don't think we're even talking about military equipment, but just to keep the economy functioning there and make sure that people get paid and so on and so forth. Well, if it takes 140 billion euros for 2 years, then 100 million is not even equal to a day. So he hasn't even managed to convince them to give up more than even 2 days. Even what so far what he has to show for this trip so far is less than 2 days. And that's just extraordinary. And I think that just tells you the dire straits that they're in. We're talking about the front lines, but maybe it's even more important if we look at the economic cliff that they're facing, the fiscal cliff that they're going to fall off of. Just today, Ursula von der Leyen, declared, because she's, the Belgians have put their foot down, the EuroClear has, the Belgian leadership has, and actually the European Central Bank, they've all said that, we can't do this. Again, basically, they've maybe not using so many words, but they said, this is illegal. And the consequences of doing this could be huge. I mean, the reputational and the damage and the liability would just be huge for doing this. So don't do it. Well, von der Leyen is gone out and said, I think it was just today in a meeting with the European Commission, she said, okay, it's either we do this or all of you are going to have to cough up the money. And I don't think they're going to do it. I think these leaders, in spite of all the brave talk and the photo ops, whatever, they don't have it, or it would be so deeply unpopular because they would have to cut services, things that their people really want. They know they can't do it. They can't actually provide that much money. So that's, again, that just shows a very, very grim reality that the Ukrainians are facing. I just, thinking about it, we'll see what happens. But there we find some reason to hope, because I think like this option of seizing the assets is kind of the nuclear option. And it's like the fiscal equivalent of nuclear war. And when they got to there, the Europeans have gone so far, but when they reached that, there were enough people who understood what was going on and say, hey, we can't do this. They went along with everything else. But when it actually came to this, there have been very important people who have put their foot down and say, we can't do this. Now, of course, von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and so many of the others are just so nutty. And Chancellor Merz is another, they want to do it. But it's looking now, maybe we'll find out tomorrow that I'm wrong about this, but it's looking now that the realists have won this. We'll see. And that sort of gives me a certain amount of hope that in spite of all the insanity, all the crazy people there in Europe, the von der Leyens and the Merzes and so on, there are enough people that still are sane that, maybe when we get to the military cliff that we're talking about, when a collapse really occurs and there will be pressure, the von der Leyens and Kaja Kallas and probably Macron too will be talking about, sending troops. There will be enough realists in various defense departments who will say that we can't do this. Again, it just gives me some hope that because these people, you just think they're utterly insane. Some of them seem to be, but there are enough people that have retained enough sanity that maybe in the end they'll realize that they've lost it and will accept it. Will accept the fact of their loss.
Yeah, I imagine many of these leaders have to be thinking that we can't be throwing good money after bad. If nobody else is putting up, why would you put up? Why? Right. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. And then so that's why I think von der Leyen's call would say, okay, each of you have to cough it up. It's not, I'd be very surprised if that's going to happen.
Right. And I think the corruption scandal just makes it impossible to, paper it over with your population. Say like, okay, we need to send another 10 billion or whatever to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Everybody's going to start holding up that picture of the golden toilet. And so it's true. I think their ability to finance Ukraine is gone. Either they're out of money, one thing, they don't have the support from the people to do it. So when are they going off this fiscal cliff? And it was supposed to be soon, right? They're supposed to be the end of this winter, like
something like that.
I've heard different things, like March or something. I don't know.
Yeah, there are reports now. I don't know whether or not they're true, but there are already reports that like the amount of funds flowing to Ukraine has significantly diminished over the last several months. And I don't know, I'm sure somebody knows, but it's not something, it's not a figure that's very easily available. But definitely like by the spring of next year.
So what happens when Ukraine runs out of money? Like, does that just make the war over? We were just talking earlier about how that I don't see how this war can end, that it will always be some kind of festering wound and semi-hot war going along that border. If they're out of money, does that just mean that the ideology dies with it if it's not being funded?
Well, I don't think it means the ideology dies, but it means, that, of course, Ukraine is significantly weakened. You'll have a rump Ukraine with huge fiscal needs. It'll just be kind of a black hole that the Europeans will have to constantly pour money into.
But they can't, right?
Well, they can, it'll be a smaller Ukraine, I guess, but just to keep it from utterly collapsing, um, they may. I don't know. Yeah, it's going to be hard for them to do it. It's true. They may be incentivized to do it when they say that they realize, well, if we don't do it, they're all going to flood our countries. They're already 5 million refugees in Europe right now, but there could easily be another 20 million if there is a total economic collapse there.
So that's what would happen. The whole economy is just being supported by
Oh
the
yeah,
U.S. and West. I mean, if once that is gone, then people just start starving. Like, what?
yeah. Well, yeah. That's the risk, and then again, it shows the recklessness of their attacks on the tankers. If it invites this response that Putin has threatened, that's part of the economy that still remains is their grain exports. And, there are a few other things, commodities that they still produce that, it's not enough to keep the economy going, but it does offset, some of the losses that they've suffered elsewhere. It's just, so anyway, if they lose that, then if the fiscal needs become all the more, really extreme. It's already more than the Europeans can handle. But if they can't even export grain, then they just don't have any currency, and then they'll be demanding even more from the Europeans, more again euros that the Europeans don't have.
We really didn't think this Ukraine thing through, did we? When this whole thing started, I mean, what's the idea? You're going to prop up this government? Do we have a plan to unprop it? You just stay there funneling funds and money forever until Russia's destroyed? That was the plan? There's no...
Yeah. Yeah, well, of course, the thing is that Russia was supposed to collapse a couple of years ago, and it refused to do that. It didn't perform its assigned role. There clearly was a great deal of confidence that it was not just, an economic collapse, but a military collapse. In 2023, there was a great deal of confidence. Again, you just go back there and you just read the articles. All kinds of Americans and Europeans and Ukrainians, they were just sure. They knew that the Russians were total incompetence. I think, again, they probably believed their own propaganda. They thought that, like, the Russians thought they could invade all of Ukraine. They were going to seize Kiev and then march to the west, and we drove them back. Again, that's the way it was presented at the time. Of course, as it's become increasingly clear that the Russians were not defeated in that way, and they went in with a very small force because they had limited objectives, and that retreat from Kiev was part of a goodwill gesture in the hopes that the Istanbul agreement could be finalized. But they seized on it. They created this propaganda, and it seems like they get convinced by their own propaganda. And they thought they could do it. They thought they could bring out about the collapse of the Russian military and of the Russian economy, but neither has happened. They're both stronger than they were back in 2022. And there's increasing admissions of that, within the West. There is this growing awareness at the edges, anyway, of their consciousness.
Okay, well, yeah, I just feel so bad for Ukraine. I mean, they
I do too.
Just got obliterated on just every single level, and just the country is it's just done. I feel like it's over. And then we're looking at the future. We're talking about a fiscal collapse. So that'll probably happen. What do you think that'll lead to? A refugee crisis and another crisis? Do you think that at that point the nuclear option to steal the assets will be taken? Do you think that could happen?
Well, that's the risk. I'm saying that the pressure to do that has become intense recently. They've been pushing harder and harder, people like von der Leyen and Merz. But again, the realists that have stood their ground, and it looks like it's probably not going to happen. But again, I don't think they're going to give up. That's true. And they may.
What happens when they do it? Why is this the nuclear option? Does this just destroy Europe's economy and reputation? Is that the main thing?
Yeah. Well, it's a real blow to the reputation of Europe. If you're going to have if you're going to depend in large part on financial services, as these postmodern economies in Europe and the U.S. have done, you need to have a reputation. A lot of that depends actually on a reputation for financial probity. In other words, people need to trust you. Okay, these people, they stick by their rules, and I can put my money there, and I know that no matter what happens, it's going to be safe, and then I can withdraw when I can. We all understand this on one level. Just think about a bank. Are you going to put your money in a bank when you just learned that, oh, they just grabbed my neighbor's money because they didn't like him? Right? Say, I'm taking my money out of that bank. I'm going to put it out. So that's the real danger. EuroClear is where I guess 185 billion euros of Russian assets are now parked. They're frozen. I think, in fact, the freezing of them has already done damage. As for my understanding, is that there has been a movement out, from Europe in general because of this. But if they take this next step, it would just be outright theft. Because there's this loan arrangement. Everybody knows that the Ukrainians will never repay this loan. So using it as collateral is, in other words, saying that we're just taking this.
Well, if the damage is mostly reputational damage, then I think the damage has already been done, right?
A lot of it has, right.
Right.
A lot of it has, but I guess, this is just further damage, just saying that, okay, we're worried about a lot of these developments in Europe, but it's still Europe. They have this long and the different central banks know, they know about the head of the European. This guy, he understands what's going on. Everything will be okay. But maybe these people, like the head of EuroClear and the head of the European Central Bank, they may, in the end, just not be able to resist the fanatics within Europe. And if that happens, that is further reputational damage, and it just does. Again, this is as we've discovered, the manufacturing might of Europe was greatly overrated. There seems to be an economy that is to at least some extent financialized. It's an important part of what's kept them going and has made them rich. And then if you strike a severe blow against this sector of their economy, yeah, that's really quite serious. Again, EuroClear it's not a minor player. We're talking, I think, about trillions of dollars are kept there. And, of course, it's not their money. So it's just like if those trillions of dollars go somewhere else, it's not to say that Europe has actually lost trillions of dollars, but they do make money, a lot of money off of that, of offering, providing these financial services. Now, as a certain amount is within Europe, and they can, the European governments can just agree to keep their money there. So it's not going to be that it's all going to leave. But there is a lot of money from places like China, and other. With the rise of the rest, the rise of the global majority, it's not possible for an organization like EuroClear to disregard the rest of the world. They that's part of that makes them, what they are. And they if they lose that business or a significant part of that business, that's really serious damage that will be done to them.
I just think I'm surprised they haven't lost all of that business already. I mean, if you're using your neighbor analogy, where it's like, okay, your neighbor opened up a bank account. They didn't steal his money, but they froze his account, and they just talk about it every day about how they could steal the money. They're always getting together every other week to say, maybe we should steal that money. Nation's like, well, I'm not going to put my money in that bank, right? I mean, like, if you're China, why would you?
Yeah, like the longer, you're right. The longer this goes on, the longer the vultures, the circle, the Russian assets, and the more they talk about it, sure, that in itself is doing damage. I think you're completely right. It's a good point.
I'm almost curious. Like, I don't know if this has ever happened before in history. I don't know if anybody knows exactly what happens if they steal those assets and send it. Like, I almost wanted to play out. Like, okay, what does this mean exactly? What will be the financial repercussions on the markets, on just the whole battle of multipolarity versus the U.S. hegemony, the rules-based international system? I just feel like that's a big piece of it, but nobody I think everybody knows what's going on. Like just what I said, they froze the assets and they're talking about taking them. It should be there. And is there something specific when this action is taken? And then when China's like, all right, we're pulling the plug, everybody's pulling the plug. And I just want to see what happens.
Yeah, I don't
guess
know.
we shouldn't wish for it, but
Yeah, but the Russians might be wishing for it. It's a possibility, even though it's
you
their
think so?
asset.
The Russians might be
I think
like,
it's
take it, do it.
I'm just speculating, but it's just they're probably figuring we're never going to see those again anyway.
There was talk
But
about them getting the money back as part of them signing the peace deal. Like, we'll give you
yeah,
your
well,
money back.
but that's a peace deal that the Russians are not going to agree
They're not
to.
right,
That's
right.
that's a 28-point plan that's been obviously it's got Trump's fingerprints on it. He wants to take some of those assets and put them into some fund, into the Trump fund or something, in Ukraine, and then the Americans will get. It'll be matched by some other funds, and then the Americans will get 50% of the profits and something. It's not something the Russians are going to agree to.
What do you think Russia would even do with that money? I don't understand. It seems like they've been doing fine without it. When they get it,
Yeah,
they're like,
obviously they've right. Well, one thing is the Russians do have, they have planned for a rainy day. They're the neighbor who's, hey, I lost all that money in the bank. It's serious. I'm not happy about this. But this neighbor has a lot of gold in his basement and, and money in other banks and whatever. He's going to do all right. He's not, he's in no danger of collapsing as a result of that. Nowhere near. Of course, you'd like to, who doesn't want 300 billion euros or dollars or whatever the total is, but they can do without it.
Yeah, well, clearly they've been doing pretty well without it. Okay, well, maybe we should move over to Venezuela. Are we in a real pickle over there?
Yeah, I don't know what to say. Again, it's the war that is forever imminent, and it's still imminent. And I still expect that it's going to happen soon, but just who knows? There may be. Again, we've speculated that Trump is actually hearing from different people that, hey, this could go. Is this might work? But it could, then again, it could go seriously wrong, and he doesn't want it to go seriously wrong. So he's trying to get Maduro to step down. He wants to avoid this. And the fact that he wants to avoid this tells him that he realizes that there is a downside to this whole thing. Both there are military risks and there are risks at home. It may not be so popular if it especially goes the wrong way. It's not going to be popular with his base and anger a lot of independents and so on and so forth. So he's probably looking at all this. But still, I expect that he, at some point you just have to, you can't keep that fleet out there forever. At some point, you got to launch the operation. And I'm expecting it to happen soon, just like everybody else. But who knows? It might be there another month. One recent development, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about this, is that Trump pardoned the former president of Honduras, Juan Hernandez. He was serving a 45-year sentence for smuggling cocaine into the U.S. In fact, he had bragged about it, said, like, we're going to stuff the cocaine up the noses of those gringos. And apparently we're talking about nothing minor, something like, what is it, 400 tons? Exactly, yeah. 400 tons of cocaine.
It's a lot of cocaine.
What we're talking about. Yeah, that's a lot of cocaine. And the guy was associated with El Chapo in Mexico. He was a major player, and he was the president of this country. So here you're talking about, of course, the pretext for war against Venezuela is drugs. And then you pardon this guy. I mean, it's just so absurd. You just think that, maybe you would try to do the pardon later or something or whatever.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? But I think it's just like, it's vintage Trump. It's just like, yeah, of course there's a pretext, but it's just like virtually every war launched by the U.S. has some kind of pretext. But in the past, we're better at presenting our case and hiding the reality, the real motivations. Trump is just sort of out in the open. He doesn't, he says the quiet part out loud, as we've said many times. So it's just clear. It has nothing to do with drugs. And, it has,
Well, why would he pardon him though? Is there some plan of like putting him back in power or something? I mean,
Well,
what's the
the best I can tell, from what I've read, is that somehow, Trump is very responsive to praise and to personal gifts and that kind of thing. And what people have learned is this, like, if you get a hold of him, if you make, you sing his praises, and, you get your cousin to go over there and, offer him a gold plated something or other. And that will, that can reap some huge benefits. You can get what you want if you do that. Again, we saw that at play in the Persian Gulf. Remember the 747 and everything else. He loved it, and it's something that's sort of the world that he inhabits. He doesn't really necessarily like understand this neocon ideology or whatever, but he understands people who praise him and give him gifts, and he likes to reciprocate. Again, as I say, he's very transactional. So that's what I've heard, is that there's that. Maybe it's not much more than that, but it's also, this guy has always presented himself as very pro-American, a pro-American conservative. And that's something that Trump likes too. So he decided, he was just a victim of Biden like myself, and so we're going to give him a pardon. He only served 1 year of his 45-year term.
Really? You just think that somebody would have tapped Trump on the shoulder and be like, hey, the optics of this aren't great right now.
No.
Let's wait till after we do this thing. It's just amazing that so it's amazing that we're going to be going to war that's without any groundwork, not even a good, like, the WMD story wasn't great, but this is just absurd. What's going on right now? It's comical.
Yeah.
But I wonder, do you think that we could potentially be trapping ourselves in this war through the actions we have done so far in the Caribbean? We had that recent double tap on that boat that's been causing a bit of a controversy. Pete Hegseth, apparently, I don't know if they said he gave the order to kill everybody, but basically they hit a boat. There's some survivors that are clinging onto the wreckage, and they say they take no survivors, kill them. And they did that. And so, I mean, this is just a war crime. And so when you start to do some of these types of actions, and then you can't just sort of pack it up and go home. People are like, so mission accomplished? What, we just blew up some boats and said no survivors and killed them? Why didn't you try to rescue them? Is there going to be repercussions? And now they're like, we've messed up.
There certainly is a risk of that. And there also, in some cases, there have been survivors. And the thing is that the survivors have brought lawsuits against the U.S. because clearly, again, these are war crimes. This is the very, very clear violations of U.S. law and international law. And, like in one case, I think it was the guy is a fisherman, at least that's what they say. And he said, we're out on a fishing boat. Our engine broke down. We started drifting, and then bam. And my brothers or my buddies were killed, and I just managed to, I ended up in the water, but somebody rescued me. And I think these, that's the, there are similar stories. Other stories like this, and some of these survivors, according to what I've heard, are looking at, let's say, their legal options, and it could prove to be a real problem.
Do you think when these actions, do you think there's any kind of realization from people within the military that they might think, like, wait a second, maybe are we the bad guys if we start saying things like no survivors, don't take prisoners, double taps like this, that like, hey, that's bad guy behavior, right?
Yeah, right. Again, it's just sort of like, it's a Trump style. I mean, it's just under previous presidents, there was always this cloak of ideology and, humanitarian concern. We're doing this because we care about the Iraqis or the Kosovars or whatever. In fact, I think that was all nonsense. But there was an effort to cloak, the crude geopolitical realities And Trump is not, he's just not into that, you know. He just, that's not, he just, again, like I've said, he says the quiet part out loud. He's just like, yeah, we're the awesome United States and we can do what we want. And look at that. I blew something else up. Isn't that great? Again,
Yeah,
I don't know that he does any more harm than any of these previous presidents, but he just, his personality makes the injustices just so very obvious. And he really is
right.
doing tremendous damage to American soft power.
Right. I just wonder if there's going to be any real repercussions from what we've done so far. Like if these war crimes, if they start to pick up some more attention in the media and they get more heat, then would it be something like, okay, well, we have to just stick with our story that these are narco-terrorists and we have to go to war, or will they be able to just pull back? I mean, I'm just hoping that the U.S. that we don't do this, but it just seems like we're stuck there and we're going to. And I think maybe part of the reason is because of what we've done so far. Like, what will we say to everybody when we go back that we just
Yeah.
killed?
Yeah, well, of course you're going to claim that they were all narco terrorists and it was a great victory, and then the drug trade has suffered a serious setback, and you know, isn't this wonderful? But it doesn't seem to be convincing a lot of people. I'm sure it's working with some people, but the majority of Americans haven't bought it. They're not supporting this planned military intervention.
Well, when this is all said and done, this huge battle between U.S. hegemony and multipolarity, will there be actual war crimes, war crime trials or tribunals? It just seems like no matter what, people in the West, we can start wars, we can invade countries, blow people up, and then just nothing ever happens,
Right.
ever. But when we enter into a new multipolar world, you shouldn't be able to do that, right? Will there be
Well,
another, or it'll be
it has
within
to
their sphere,
it has
within
to
their
happen,
spheres, I guess.
either a country, war crimes trials only take place under, let's say, really two sets of circumstances. One is if a country is entirely conquered. Let's say if the Russians actually just conquered all of Ukraine and they were able to seize some people that were, for example, responsible for the Odessa massacre, and then they could actually conduct a war crimes trial. That's something that that's a stated objective, actually, but they may never get these people because they'll probably be able to flee. But that happened, of course, in Germany. At the end, the Allies took Germany, and so many of these German officers, generals, admirals, and so forth were there. They were arrested and they were put on trial, the Nuremberg trials, right? But the other possibility is a revolution. Is that, again, it's like a completely new power that opposed what the previous regime was doing. They too would be willing to subject these people to war crimes trials. But in the absence of either of those scenarios, I don't see it. It just doesn't happen. It just doesn't
Right.
happen. Of course, I'd like to see it happen, but it's not the main thing. The main thing is for the wars to end, for new policies to be instituted. Talking about pardons and the possible conviction of a war criminal, I think we should turn to Israel very briefly, because Netanyahu has actually presented a request for a pardon
I saw that.
to the Prime Minister of Israel, Herzog, and so a lot of people within Israel are very, very angry about this. At least half of Israel is. There's the half of Israel that hates him, the half of Israel that loves him. The half that hates him just is up in arms about this. They want to see him convicted. What I've heard is that, in spite of all of his delaying tactics, he's managed to cancel all kinds of hearings for security reasons. He keeps on starting new wars. He keeps on bombing, new parts of the Middle East. So there's always an excuse, or almost always. But even in spite of all that, the trials have gone forward, and what the the Israelis, at least the leftist Israeli press, is saying is that it does really look bad for Netanyahu. He clearly did engage in corruption. Now, none of this is for war crimes. Again, he probably would never be convicted of war crimes. That's just the sad truth. But he could be convicted of corruption, and he doesn't want to do that. So he's made this request. He's supported by Trump in this. Trump actually wrote a letter,
Right.
a formal letter, asking for that he be pardoned. And so now the prime minister is considering the request. Now he's I'm subjected to a lot of pressure on both sides. We'll see what he'll do. I think probably he will grant it, but he might put some conditions on this. It's like, but you have to actually end your attacks on the judiciary. That's one thing that's being floated. Because another thing that makes the more liberal half of Israel, really hate Netanyahu's his attacks on the judiciary, and then also maybe you got to retract this bill that which was an attempt to gain more control over the media. So there might be some kind of deal that's made. Okay, we'll let you go, but you're going to have to pull back on these fronts, for example. Part of me, of course, I would love to see the guy in jail. On the other hand, I think if he's pardoned, that might actually be good because, as we've talked about, that's something that he always kind of incentivized him to be very reckless.
Right.
He said, there's going to be a hearing next week. Let's launch another war. We've seen that happen again and again. And now, if that pressure is off of him, he might, I can't be confident of this, but he might be, just a little bit more cautious in his pursuit of expansion.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. If they say no pardon, then I guess we could expect war with Iran or something like this, or a reopening in Gaza. I mean, are they trying to give any pretense that they're trying to abide by the ceasefire anymore, the Israelis, or what's the situation right now for the?
Well, they don't have to even pretend. That's the thing, because they kill people every other day, or not every other day. Virtually every day, and sometimes quite a few people. I think just yesterday, in the last 24 hours, we're talking about another 3. That's often children. It just goes on and on and on, and they still are not keeping their part of the bargain. They're not allowing all the trucks in. They're not allowing the equipment to remove the rubble. And the suffering continues. It's maybe a little. It's better than it was when the war was ongoing, before the ceasefire, but the suffering clearly continues. And, there's still a lot of people. People are staying alive, but they're not really getting enough calories. And there are just a lot of people that are starving. They're not quite starving to death, but they're starving. There are many women who end up having stillborn children because they don't have sufficient nutrition. It's the reality. I think there's 700,000 children are actually living in tents and, without proper shelter. Again, there's been some very bad weather. This goes on and on. It's just constant misery. And it's, the world, much of the world has kind of taken their eyes off of it. And the leadership in Europe, that was because they were feeling real pressure. They were starting to do symbolic things. They didn't really do anything substantive, but they were doing symbolic things to show that to pretend that they cared about the suffering of the Gazans. But because of the ceasefire, so-called, they have they're no longer under that pressure, and so they have even reversed some of these very, very minor wrist slaps that they had put on Israel.
What do you think is going to happen to the Gazans? Will they have a chance to I mean, the place is just utterly destroyed. It would take forever to rebuild. Are they just going to keep them living in rubble?
Even if you're getting, the 600 trucks a day and you got the equipment in there, whatever, it would be very hard to rebuild. And they only, again, understand they have less than half of the already, small territory that they once lived on. Yeah, I mean, it's really grim. It's very, very grim. And clearly that's the way the Israelis want it. They haven't given up on their ethnic cleansing dream.
So they're just going to keep the Gazans living in rubble for indefinitely, and just in what, just try to
Yeah,
kill a few. You're not going to kill them all. But I mean, it can't be like this for 5 years, 10 years, right? There has
I,
to.
I would think so. I just don't know. It's so, they need to come under pressure from the U.S. above all. And that's not really happening. Trump wanted a deal. He wanted it to be declared Cyrus the Great. He wanted to say that he brought peace to the Middle East for the first time in 3,000 years, or some nonsense like that. He got what he wanted. It's just like we see how these deals work out, but these deals are always a lot less than what they appear at first glance. All kinds of details weren't worked out, and there's no follow through. They're not pushing the Israelis to keep their side of the bargain. They're violating the ceasefire every day, and there are no consequences for the Israelis.
I feel like there has to be. It's just so infuriating when we talk about what Israel does to the Palestinians, and then just nothing happens, nothing changes. It's just.
Yeah.
It is, but there is change. There's change within this country a little bit. The anti-Zionist movement is strong now. The Real America First movement has gone forward. So I think that's our only hope. But we have to see what happens in these midterms, and maybe we can put some pressure. But it's just like, man, I imagine living in those conditions for years. I mean, just getting through this winter. I was in Jerusalem and the West Bank in 10 years ago in January, and it snowed. I remember it snowing there, so it gets cold, it's it's unusual for it to snow, but it's going to be tough. You get cold rain,
Right.
there in Gaza for all these kids in tents. It's bad. And I don't know what to say. The world is looking away more and more. That's the unfortunate thing. I hope we can.
Yeah,
We can't forget
but not
about
the whole
Gaza.
world. I mean, still, the anti-Zionist movement has been energized, and like we see it for example, in the UK, there has just been a constant protests, and police have been cracking down, and it just looks really bad. Old ladies, people in wheelchairs, people holding up signs, like "Stop the Genocide." They get handcuffed and dragged away. I heard. Just as kind of a test and to show the blatant hypocrisy, some people will hold up signs that say supporting the genocide, and pretty much, and they do not get arrested.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
That's such a black stain
And
on
yeah,
their
people
history.
see it, and I'm sure that even no question, among the police in the UK, there has to be a lot of discomfort. I certainly hope there is. I imagine there is. So it hasn't gone away, and there has been a real change, a sea change. It's just the problem is that the leadership is as devoted to Zionism as ever in both the U.S. and in Europe, and those bums just need to be thrown out.
Yeah. Amen. Okay, well, I think we can end it there, Dad. Thanks for another depressing conversation.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
All right,
Bye
bye-bye.
bye.